Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to start with lesson 3 on the Westward Expansion unit, and we're going to talk about life on the frontier. So, as people moved west and began to expand into those territories and start a new life, they are going to face some difficulties and challenges that are going to be unique to this new area that they're settling. So, we're going to look at those and see what they had going on as they moved out west. So one of the main things that happens with this westward expansion is the availability of cheap lands. So as the Indians are removed, as the buffalo are continuously killed, there is lots of new land, and it is really cheap. The government is pretty much giving it away. The railroads advertised that the desert land that's out west was fertile, that people could grow things there. Wasn't actually true. In some cases, a lot of it is very unfertile, very hard and inhospitable for people to be developing crops. But the railroads want money from people buying land, so they lie, and people make that big long journey all the way out west, thinking that they're going to be able to get really fertile, great land, and that doesn't always turn out to be the case. In 1862, the government creates the Homestead Act, and it promises settlers 160 acres of land for $1.65 an acre if they work it for 6 months, or they could have it for free if they lived there for 5 years and grew crops. So the railroads also sold land cheap because they expected to make money back when settlers moved out there and then needed to use the railroad to get supplies from the cities out east. So all in all, for immigrants coming in, for former slaves, for people just looking for a new start, this ends up being a really good deal, and thousands of people are going to flock to the lands out west. So an example here, and I'm going to show you a little bit, one of the ways that the government would like to allow people to get lands was to have them race for it. So this is a clip from the movie Far and Away, and takes place in Oklahoma, and this is an example of how people would get land. You're not going to probably be able to hear the audio on this, so I'll show you a short portion of it, and then I'll show it again in class. So as you could see in the clip, people were actually racing for the land. So as people moved ahead and the government gave away the land, they would section the areas, the territories out into sections of 160 acres. And then in some cases like this one, they would do races where everybody would get a different flag, and they would start the race, and basically you would take your horse or your wagon and run as quickly as you could to an area of land that was numbered, and then you would pull out that numbered flag, stick your flag in, and then you take the number flag back to the homestead office, and they would give you the deed for that land. It didn't always end up good for people. So the railroad companies would advertise land, millions and millions of acres, as you can see from the advertisement on the left. That is an actual advertisement for Iowa and Nebraska territory. So you can see that it's on sale for 10 years of credit, and it's being sold by the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad companies. So people with their families would take up their covered wagons and make the journey from cities out west in the hopes that they would be able to start a new life and get land for the first time and be landowners out in the western territories of the United States. So it goes through several evolutions and stages based on the economic activity that happens out in the West. And different regions have different settlement habits based on the local resources. So those areas and the things that affect the different stages of settlement are going to be the four items listed below. So mining boom, cattle kingdom in the open range, farming frontiers, and the diversity of experiences. So we're going to talk about each of those here in a second. We're going to start with the mining boom. So the first people to move out west are miners, and they are prospectors, people that work the land, and they are attracted to the areas where gold and silver are discovered. So that would be California. You're going to get silver and some gold in Nevada and Arizona, and then eventually in South Dakota, which happens to be the home of the Sioux Indians. And they move out west because they're hoping to make a lot of money. So when all of the people travel out west, we get towns that are created that kind of spring up almost overnight in areas where the gold is discovered. Their towns are often set up before a system of law is set up. So when you think of the old West movies where people have shootouts, those things actually happen and they're real. So movies like Tombstone are created because of the precious metals that are discovered out west. There's lots of violence, and you get vigilantes, so citizens who take it upon themselves to enforce the law. So if you've ever heard of the movie Tombstone, if you've never seen it, you get Wyatt Earp, who's really famous for his shootout at the OK Corral. Great movie, and if you're unfamiliar with it and you want more information, go ahead and Netflix that movie because it really is a great movie. The next part is going to be cattle kingdom. So as people move west, there's also a lot of open land, which means ranchers can raise cattle and are able to then move that cattle and sell it for meat to eastern cities that are looking for that resource. So it only lasted about 20 years, and after the Civil War, several million wild cattle roamed the Great Plains. In Texas especially, they decided to drive them north to the nearest railroad, and then they shipped them to Chicago, which is where we have the big slaughterhouses, and we'll talk about those in the next unit as we get into industrialization. The cuts of beef were slaughtered in Chicago, and then they were put on the train and shipped to cities in the Northeast for people to pay a lot of money for that meat. So driving cattle to the railroad took the cowboys about 3 months, and it was considered a long drive. And as they made their way, they would graze or eat on short grasses of the open range. So these were public lands that didn't belong to anybody, and at the time they weren't fenced in. That's going to change as we get all of these people that move out west and want to farm. So they're eventually going to fence in their areas, and it's going to kind of kill out the way of the cowboys. So cowboys did all of the driving of these cattle to the Northeast to the railroads, and of the cowboys, actually 20% of them are African Americans or freed slaves who move out west looking to get away from Jim Crow and the segregation that exists in the South. This is a picture of what it would be like driving cattle. So you had these cowboys who would take thousands and thousands of heads of cattle and push them on very long journeys all the way up to the railroads through the Great Plains in kind of this vast open space. So it's really where we get kind of the idea of the cowboys and where all of those Old West movies come from. Problems that are going to arise from this are overgrazing. So a lot of the grass in the Great Plains is destroyed. A lot of it is going to be eventually fenced in with barbed wire, and we're going to enter into some economic hard times in the Northeast, which means that people aren't going to be willing to buy as much meat, or they're not going to have as much money to buy meat, so the prices are going to fall, and that means some of the cattle is going to go unsold. This is going to end up really hurting the cattle industry and eventually going to driving some cowboys out of business. The Great Plains is also going to get drought and severe winters that are going to kill off a lot of the cattle and put an end to a lot of these long drives. But the cattle ranchers are still going to stay on the Great Plains. A lot of them bought their own land and raised the cattle. And eventually the railroads are going to reach Texas, which is going to make it easier for them to sell their product to the Northeast. So farmers are going to come up, and you're going to get big battles that happen between the farmers and the cattlemen, and this is going to be a problem. There's a lot of violence that happens with it. So as you can see on the picture on the right, there's going to be some very innovative farmers that are going to want to keep the cattle that are walking through from grazing through their land. So farmers would plant wheat and other crops, and then here would come 1,000 head of cattle, and they would walk through their fields and eat all their crops and destroy all of their hard work. So the farmers really wanted to keep the cattle off of their land. So, and cheap, since they didn't have a lot of trees, since this is the Great Plains and it's a treeless wasteland, they are very innovative and they create barbed wire, which I'll show you the video about when we're in class. But they are going to basically fence off their yards. So the farmers are going to win and they're going to close off their property, but it's going to lead to a lot of violence. And some people actually even hire gunmen to attack homesteaders because they want to be able to get their cattle through because, you know, they're fighting for their way of life. And people that farmed on the Great Plains really had a lot of their own issues as well. So, I mean, not only did they have the cattle farmers, but life on the Great Plains wasn't very easy. They had a lot of natural obstacles that made life really difficult. They had expected to get a lot of supplies and wood from the railroads, and those things don't actually end up showing up. So instead, they end up with droughts. There's hardly any rain. The soil is really hard for them to get through. There are no trees. The temperatures are really extreme. They're going to get locust swarms that come in and try to destroy all their crops. And a lot of the early settlers die of starvation and exposure, and many of them give up and move east again. The ones that stayed were the ones that were able to be creative and adapt to the new environment. So there weren't any trees, they couldn't make wood, and they had to build a house. So they built sod houses, which are the grass, basically a house built out of grass. So they would take all of the grasslands and they would cut it into bricks, and then they would stack those bricks and make a house out of grass. They didn't have any fuel, and since they didn't have wood, they needed to make fires. They needed to be able to cook things. This is before the time of electricity. So they would go along and find all the buffalo chips, so basically the poop of the buffalo, and they would burn it for fuel. They created windmills to create power and to pull water out of the ground, barbed wire to keep their fences in place, and they would get steel plows, which were invented by John Deere, the tractor guy, and that is up here in the top right corner, so that they created a plow that was able to cut through the hard dirt of the Great Plains so that they could farm easily, and then they were able to plant wheat. So now the Great Plains is considered the breadbasket of America. It's where we get a lot of our wheat, which makes all the bread and different items for the United States. So as people moved in, they had a lot of different experiences. Lots of different people come to the Great Plains because they are looking to own land for the first time and make their own way. So you had English-speaking Americans who left the eastern cities and wanted just big open spaces or wanted to start over. You had lots of European immigrants who came over, especially from Ireland, and then you're going to get German and French, and then eventually people from the Eastern European countries. You get African American freedmen and ex-soldiers who fought during the Civil War. You're going to get the Spanish-speaking Mexicans who come up after the Spanish-American Wars, and they're going to come north. And then we get the Chinese and Irish immigrants who had worked on the railroads and were able to buy cheap land, so they stay on in the Great Plains to make a life for themselves. So when we get into class tomorrow, we will go ahead and take a deeper look at some of these inventions and adaptations and kind of see what you guys think of what life might have been like back in that time. So go ahead and answer the questions at the bottom of this Google page and submit it, and I will see you in class tomorrow. Hope you have a great day.